Hi, I'm Jim Shaw, publisher of the Lexington Times and chairman of the board of LexMedia. I want to welcome you to another series of Coffee with the Candidates, where we talk with each of the candidates running for town-wide office about some of their ideas and their vision for serving in that particular public office. I'm honored to be with you at this moment with Patrick Mehr, who's a 25-year resident of Lexington now, I read, right?
That's right.
And no stranger to the community. Patrick has served, I want to say, for 15 years in town meeting from up until like from 2001 to 2015.
That's right.
And so you spent a lot of time at town meeting. You always were someone who made your presence known in town meeting. I like to say that you're a no-nonsense kind of guy. And you've decided to run for selectman again. This is your second time running for selectman.
Select board.
Select
indeed.
board. I'm
Yes.
sorry. Yes. See, you know,
Things change in Lexington, don't they?
Things change, and you know what? You can't teach this old dog new tricks, and I apologize for that.
That applies to me too. You know, at 71 years of age, I'm not exactly a young Doug.
So for select board, and you know, I know there's got to be some reason that's driven you back out into wanting to do this again. I know that you've always enjoyed the idea of working and serving in the public and participating and having your positions known. I want to say at the outset that you're a guy that I've come to know is a no-nonsense guy who's about the numbers. The numbers speak volumes, and a lot of people don't ever scratch down that far to really get the full picture. So with that, you know, we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the issues that are sort of hot button issues, the MBTA overlay and the rules coming out of the Commonwealth about housing requirements, the Bloom campaign, you know, whether, you know, I guess it's come down to from the new high school to Bloom. That's where the debate has sort of narrowed the focus to. So we can talk a little bit about that. And then just about some other things that may be of interest to people. So with that, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here, Patrick. And why don't we open up with, you can tell people a little bit about your background and why it is that you're running. Why is this so important to you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having this session here. I hope it's informative to the viewers. You know, it's interesting. My wife asked me just a few mornings ago, why am I doing this? You know, it's so much work to campaign. It's, you know, work to serve. Should I be elected? And there's actually a very interesting reason why I'm doing this. It's a combination of two things. First of all, as you said, I'm a numbers guy. Mm-hmm. I was trained at École Polytechnique in France, which is basically the equivalent of our MIT here. Mm-hmm. And the difference between France and the US is that if you're very good at calculus at age 15, like I was, you end up in the civil service in very technical issues in France, mm-hmm. and you sit in some ministry and you issue all sorts of rules and regulations and you take care of very big issues. Whereas had I grown up in the US and had I gone to MIT, I would be an entrepreneur and I would start a company like the one my son works at, Rivian, which mm-hmm. R.J. Scaringe, a mechanical engineer from MIT, founded, and you know, he mm-hmm. now employs, I don't know, 15,000 people. So my training was very much into numbers, but then I applied them to public policy. And then I moved to the US in 1982, so quite a while ago, to Massachusetts, mm-hmm. to Cambridge, to work in a consulting firm. And from there I moved on to the Boston Consulting Group. And there I learned that there are ways to think long term and to look at strategic issues and to understand what the numbers mean and how they impact things not only now and next year, but down the road in ways that if you don't look at those numbers, mm-hmm. you may get badly hit.
Right.
And so with all of this in mind, I served for, as you said, 15 years in town meeting, after I had actually noticed that builders would cut large trees like blades of grass when they were building a tear down. Mm-hmm. In fact, my own house is a tear down, but mm-hmm. I'm pleased to report that I asked our builder, right. Mark Barons at the time, to keep as many large trees as he possibly could. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, we have a huge oak that's something like mm-hmm. 3 meters away from our driveway, right. and it's still standing, whereas mm-hmm. in many houses I see around the neighborhood, those types of trees get cut. Right. Anyway, I got involved and I ended up co-writing the first Lexington tree bylaw, which was the very first one in Massachusetts, that provided some protection to trees on private property, which was a big legal breakthrough right. in a positive way, in my view. So that led me to serve in town meeting, and being a public policy type person and interested in numbers, I started looking at our budgets. And I looked at them in great detail. Why? Because from a moral perspective, even though obviously in general, and sadly in my view, people of, financial means are pretty much the only people who can afford these days to live in Lexington, I feel very strongly that it's very unfair that our taxes rise too fast because perhaps we haven't found ways to operate more efficiently. And so the taxes are so high that the people of lesser financial means have to leave town, which I really cannot stand. It is just not fair. It should not happen. It's, in my view, irresponsible of our town government, of which, by the way, 80% are the schools. When we say town government, I don't want to say that the police, fire, DPW are a detail, but the reality is they're only 20% of the budget. 80% is the schools. So if we are going to control the increase in taxes, the focus ought to be on the schools. And should I be elected to the select board on March 3rd, I will certainly spend 80% of my time with the schools. And Julie Hackett knows that already because I'm already asking her all sorts of very precise technical questions on how she could save, to be precise, $3 million right now if she did the right thing. And I won't perhaps go into details here because it gets to be complex. So my point is, my focus in town meeting was how can we run smarter? How to be, as now all my friendly candidates claim they are, fiscally responsible. I want to believe that I'm the one who talked about it first and showed how we can be fiscally responsible.
Can I just mention too, this would be a good time to mention that back in the day, when they were building the facility that we're sitting in right now, Avalon on Concord Ave, there was some consternation about the effects of this particular development and what it would have on the effect it would have on the schools. It was going to increase the school population, and I know the mitigation that they negotiated along with Avalon was based on some of that information, which a lot of people, including yourself, mostly you at the time, was saying. Olga said this out loud. I think she was on the school committee at the time. That information is wrong. We are going to have an effect on our schools, and it's going to cost the town significant amounts of money. Speak to that.
Let me summarize. This was in 2004, and the facility we're sitting on now was the old Met State, which basically was not in use anymore. And Avalon, a very large corporation, nationwide corporation with several $1 billion in certainly assets, possibly revenues, came in town and said, we would like to redevelop this into 387 units. And that was a great idea. And so I was sitting in town meeting and hearing our then town manager, Rick White, our then board of selectmen, I believe Gene Krieger was the chair at the time, with Peter Enrich and others on that board, and the school committee, I forget who the members were, and the appropriation committee, etc. And Avalon said, we will have 60 kids out of these 387 units. At which point I kind of woke up from my slumber and I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. How can we have 60 kids only out of 387 units? It makes no sense. People should know that Lexington is an extraordinarily strong magnet for the schools. I moved to Lexington from Cambridge for the schools, but if you look at the ratio of how many kids any community in Massachusetts has in the schools per household living in that community, the number in Lexington is 0.55. In other words, every time we have one household living either in a single-family home or in an apartment or in a condo, that produces, on average, 0.55 kids in the schools. That 0.55 is the single highest such ratio among Massachusetts' 351 cities and towns. What does it mean? It demonstrates mathematically that we are an extraordinarily strong magnet for the schools. No surprise. We have excellent schools compared with other communities, and that's great. And I support that, and I want that to continue. But back to the Avalon story. So everybody, all these major boards, all our top town officials, including the school superintendent at the time, I forget, it may have been Paul Ash, or perhaps his predecessor, I can't remember, thought 60 was fine. Until I and Olga Gutag and maybe literally 2 or 3 more of the 190 town meeting members, who all thought otherwise 60 is fine, made some noise. And then the agreement was indeed that Avalon would pay for, I forget if it's 5 or 10 years, X number of dollars for students above 111. So that period of time is long gone. So now we don't receive any more money from Avalon than their taxes. which by the way are very low for reasons I can try to explain a little further in this conversation. And so now we're on our own. And guess how many kids we have in the schools? Year in, year out, year in, year out, 212 is the 10-year average. And it's remarkably stable over time.
Right.
1 year it'll be 209, the next year it'll be 214, etc. So
from this development.
From this development of 387 dwellings. What does this tell me? It tells me that at the time, our town government just didn't think right. They did not know how to project long-term what the impact of Avalon transforming the Met State property into 387 units would do to the number of school children in the schools,
right.
which directly drives the school budget, which in turn is 80% of our total budget.
Right.
Now that's only 387 units. With MBTA developments, the problem is 10 times
right.
the scale, because we could easily have 4,000 units in town, even though we now know only of 1,120 in 9 specific MBTA projects that are in the pipeline.
Right.
And that's a huge problem where in April 2023, again, town government, to be specific, the select board, except for one member, Doug Lucenti, his 4 colleagues supported Article 34, namely to zone 228 acres for dense developments instead of just 50 as the state asked us. The school committee did not even opine. They did not even see that this would basically drive their future. The appropriation committee did not opine. It's supposed to look at our finances. So what I'm now saying is, I want more dense housing in town. We need it.
Right.
My son, who works for Rivian in California, if he wants to move back here, he can't afford to buy a $3 million home like we have in Lexington. So I do want dense housing. The question is, how much can we afford budgetarily?
Right.
And the root problem I have discovered, and if my run for this office has one positive result, is that I believe I found this very obscure but critical point. If you look at how much in real estate taxes a single family home pays of a given size, in other words, per square foot of livable area,
Right.
and you call that $100. If you then look at a condo of the same size, the condo pays only $91, which is close enough to 100, so I'm not making a big fuss of this. But if you then look at apartment buildings, apartment complexes, like the one we're sitting in right now,
Right.
or Katahdin Woods, or Countryside, etc., the number is not 100 or 91, it's 36,
Wow.
which is, in round numbers, a third. And I now believe, given all the analyses I've done, which are all online for people to look at, that this may be the core reason why we cannot afford as many dense units as I would like in Lexington, to make it possible for people who can only rent as opposed to buying a $3 million home
Right.
to live in town. Now the question is, why is that 36 number so low? I don't know yet for sure. I trust that our assessors do a very good job.
I imagine it's the valuation of the property divided by the number of units, and it's not the same as what, like a condo. The condos in Lexington, the values of condos are getting closer to the values of single-family homes. They're now selling condos in town for over $2 million.
Well, you're onto something, Jim, but
Yeah.
it's even more subtle than this. For single-family houses and for condos, as you say, the rule that the Department of Revenue of the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts imposes on our assessors is to say in a certain fiscal year, all these values for, again, single-family homes and condos have to reflect sales from calendar year 2 years behind,
I see.
actual sales, okay? Now, for apartment buildings, for reasons I don't understand, but if elected, I will look at extremely closely, the rule is different. The assessment, in other words, the value of the whole complex, is determined like for a business. And that is done by looking at the future stream of income to the owner. In the case of Avalon at Campus Drive, where we're sitting, the assessors look at all the rents that the 387 units will pay to Avalon, and then do a net present value, in other words, bring it to today in dollars, and that sets the value. My guess is that if Avalon wanted to sell these 387 units tomorrow to another owner of apartment complexes, the market value of these units would not be what the assessors determine with the net present value, it would be about 3 times that. Now, why this discrepancy? Again, I don't know. And the reason this may be the root cause of the problem we have is that once you have an assessment for a single-family house, a condo, or the place we're sitting in, which I believe is assessed around $115 million or so, the exact same rate, which if my memory serves me right is now $12.25 per thousand, is applied.
Right.
So of course, if the assessment is only 36% of what it should be,
right.
because it's been computed on the basis of a business as opposed to like your house and mine,
right.
looking at the sales of similar properties 2 years ago, of course we're getting only 36% of the taxes.
Right.
And that is, I believe, the core problem we have. Because again, I don't want the public out there to misunderstand me. I would love to have more dense housing. In fact, my friend Don McKenna, I understand, doesn't like to see tall buildings in the center because the sunshine, you know, would be, we want the sunshine on the right side of the street. I grew up in Paris. All buildings in Paris are, you know, 5, 7 stories.
Right.
And frankly, people come from all over the world to see them. They're pretty beautiful. So as far as I'm concerned, we should have tall buildings in the center. I don't care much about the sunshine on one side or the other of the street. What I would like to see is that we have more activity after 6:30, whereas if I'm in the center after 6:30, it feels like I'm in the middle of a cemetery.
Right.
You know, I believe that businesses would do better, cafes, restaurants, the movie theater, etc., if we had a whole bunch of people living in the center.
Right.
Furthermore, people should realize that if you look at the one development we have in the center, which is the 30 units at 50 Waltham Street, which is really the old Battle Green Inn. You remember that you had to go underground? Well, we have 30 condos there, and sure enough, out of those condos, we have very few kids in the schools. It's more seniors, I suppose, in part because...
Downsizers, people who downsize from their homes. Many of them, I know several of the folks who live in there, and they downsized, they sold their homes, moved there.
But they also have to be able to afford it, because I understand those don't go for much less than 1.2 million.
They don't, no.
Okay, so that doesn't solve our affordability problem.
It absolutely does
which
not.
is what MBTA apartments should.
Right.
But unfortunately, certainly our town government, which is basically why I'm running, didn't think through, didn't discover that apartment building, apartment units pay only 36% of what they should.
Right.
And in fact, 88% of our known 1,120 units in 9 MBTA projects already in the pipeline will be rental apartments.
Right.
And that's what
That's a big problem.
It's a huge problem. It will bankrupt us. So I've modeled this because nobody in government does it right now.
Right.
And what I can show is that I don't have a crystal ball like nobody does. The governor doesn't have a crystal ball, the MSBA doesn't, certainly our school committee doesn't, and I don't blame them for that. But if you look at scenarios, you say, okay, we know it's at least 15 units per acre for MBTA developments. It could go as high as the average, which right now for these 9 projects is 50 dwellings per acre. It could very well go as high as the highest, the most dense of these 9 projects, which is at 80 dwellings per acre. So if you model how many units you expect to have, at what density, on how many acres, etc., you can do the math. It's you know, 5th grade math basically, which our town government doesn't do. And what I can convince myself of is that we would have in 5, 7, 8 years to increase our taxes by something in the order of 30% under most of these scenarios. So the paradox here that the public really needs to understand is that yes, we all want more affordable housing, but if it comes in the form of thousands of apartment units that pay only 36% in taxes of what they should, then the town, to balance its budgets, would have to increase taxes on everybody, on all 12,000 existing households, by a huge amount, in the order of 30%. And that will make Lexington less affordable than it already is not. And so that's the paradox that
Placing
we need
even
to
a greater
think about.
burden on, like the senior citizens that are holding on to their homes. And
unfortunately, they will have an even harder time than today staying in town, which morally to me is unacceptable. These are people who've lived here for decades. You know, I was speaking the other day to a voter. You know, he tells me, oh, I bought my house in 1954. And I interject, I said, gee, this is the year I was born. So here is a gentleman, now, I didn't do the arithmetic, but I suppose he must be in his mid to late 80s.
Well, late 80s anyway.
Yes, and here is a man who tells me, look, I can't afford the taxes anymore. So I see the literature from my friendly competitors, and you know, they all want to be fiscally responsible. It's a magic word now. I want to ask them, what will you do? And what I would do is I would immediately adopt what's called the residential exemption, which I've been asking for in this town for 20 years now. By a vote of 3 out of 5 select board members, we could immediately rebalance our taxes so that smaller houses would pay less than they do today, and big houses, like these monsters I see all over town, by right, which now sell for $3 million and up, would pay more, and they certainly can afford it. And I'm told, well, no, because that's not means tested. To which I say, okay, so what should we do to get it means tested? And the answer is we need special legislation from Beacon Hill.
Right.
It's called a home rule petition. So 6 years ago, a committee said, we want a residential exemption, but it should be means tested. Well, I just checked. In 6 years, nobody, not the select board, not that committee, not town meeting, not anybody else, has done anything to even file the home rule petition that we need.
Right.
So should I be elected on March 3rd, I will immediately campaign among my 4 colleagues to find 2 of them to immediately institute the residential exemption, because I don't want the gentleman who moved in his house the year I was born to have to leave town because our taxes are so high. It makes no sense.
It's fair enough. You know, the town has changed considerably. I'm 64. I've lived here my entire life. I remember when we had blue-collar families in town. I remember when police officers and teachers could live in town, DPW workers, and they were the core of the community. That's all changed now.
Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying we shouldn't change.
Yeah.
We now have a large number of Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, and I think this is all for the good.
Yeah.
You have a French American sitting right here, okay? We all contribute to the community.
Yes.
You know, we'll have an article which I will strongly support in town meeting to allow green card holders to vote in local elections. Now,
Right.
unfortunately, we can't do it as a town. We have again to petition the Beacon Hill,
Right.
but you know, things change.
Right.
And as I said, you know, I believe that having in the town center 1 story or maybe 2, I forget now, is frankly, from my perspective, not appropriate.
Right.
Now, maybe it was appropriate 100 years ago because it was done,
Right.
but today things change. You know,
Right.
we need to be closer indeed to bus stops, and we need to have more activity, and we need to attract businesses instead of having empty storefronts or only banks. And the only way I can think of doing this, as opposed to having, you know, more staff people in town hall who supposedly attract businesses, you know, businesses function based on the profit and loss at the end of the year.
Right.
So to improve the profit and loss of any business, you want to have more foot traffic, and that means more stories in the center.
Right. And you know, and everyone's focused on that. They're working on it, diversity of businesses in town. You know, we've just spent a considerable amount of money and time sort of refacing Lexington Center, the downtown, the Lexington Center project. I forgot the name of the project. That basically we did the sidewalks and pretty much the look of it, the new lanterns and all of this. It's beautiful.
It's beautiful, but we still have a double pole at the corner of Muzzy Street and Mass Ave that's been there for, about 6 years. It's been illegal after 90 days.
Right.
And we're not doing anything to beautify that part of town, let alone the hundreds of illegal double poles that we have in town.
Right. Well, one of my personal things is, you know, doing a lot. I try to do a lot of stuff in East Lexington. Like I work with a bunch of businesses out in East Lexington to do the wreaths and the flower barrels, to do some kind of beautifications, because East Lexington always seems to get less left out of the equation. But at any rate, but I agree with you. I celebrate the diversity. This town has changed in a lot of ways. The one thing I feel badly about, and this is 20-something years ago, when the trend began on tearing down homes, 25 years ago, we looked at it. Our article at the time looked at it, looking at the Vision 2020 plan. They had all of the different planks in the 2020 plan, and we found out that if this trend continues, and it did, we actually called the article, "Is this the Lexington you want?" And of course, the community answered, "Yes, it is," because they continue to do the teardowns. But if we continue to tear the these affordable houses down, we will foreclose on our children's future and their ability to come back into this community, and that's exactly what had happened. But we posed a question because in that 2020 vision plan, there was also an economic diversity plank, which I think has gone out the window because young people can't afford to come to this town. I believe, and I'm not running for anything, I'm just saying, based on what
Maybe
I'm hearing
you should.
But,
so I wouldn't have to do it.
The last time we did something significant, I think, in terms of affordable housing, and more importantly, affordable home ownership, was the multi-condominium complex. But we were able to bring young Lexingtonians in so they could have their first opportunity to buy, build equity, and begin to put roots down in the community. There are so many people that you and I both know that started there. I'm not going to list them off, but the fact is we know them. We know them personally. And it worked. And, there are builders in town like Ben Finnegan and Ozon from D&D. They're part of this. They've got bids in to do some of the MBTA work. But all of the units are being sold, so they're supportive. I know Ozon talked directly about affordable home ownership and how important that is.
Look, if elected, one of the things I'd look into is why is it that monster houses of 5,000 or 6,000 square feet on a regular sized lot are allowed by right?
Right.
I haven't met Ben Finnegan, but I can tell you that he built a house 2 streets away from me on Monroe, to be precise, and he cut a huge oak that was further away from the driveway than the one that Mark Barron's kept on my property at my request. And so that's one side problem with trees. But more importantly, the houses that he builds are worth, $3 million and up.
Right.
Why is that? The kind of out-of-the-box thinking that I would want to look into is why don't we have a maximum in terms of cubic feet?
Right. But some of these builders are also interested in doing two-family housing, like throughout all of Lexington, not just in certain zones like East Lexington, which would slowly approach the problem and address the problem. But anyway, we're getting off.
But it's not off at all. What you just mentioned, Jim, is really interesting. Imagine for a minute that by magic, every single of our 11,000 or so single-family lots becomes a two-family house. Obviously, the school population would double.
Right. Theoretically,
do you think that the income from real estate taxes would double? No. Why? Because, of course, a two-family house, well, it would be a little higher, I would assume. But if my house is now valued at $4 million, if I divide it into two, I don't think it would be 2.8. It may be 1.8, 2 maybe, whatever. But it wouldn't be double. So now we're back to this core issue of can we balance the books?
Right.
Okay, now I may be fine with every lot in town being a two-family house, but I wouldn't be fine until and unless somebody demonstrates to me that we can still balance the budgets. And that's why I'm running for this office.
Okay.
That is the only reason. Namely, we cannot make any major decision in town, which includes first and foremost land use, which is in the domain of the planning board, which, as I have said publicly, has become a dangerous, rogue operation. Why? Because they don't do any of this planning. They should be called the Construction Review Committee or something of that sort. It can't happen because the name planning board is in the state law, of course. But so land use decisions are critical. School operations decisions are the second most critical, and only third are, in my view, municipal issues like, how many police officers do we want, how many fire stations, etc. Okay, that's frankly a small 20% of the budget. So the reason I'm running is we need in town government somewhere, somehow, and I'm not clear in my mind how that will happen, but we absolutely need, before we make any land use decision, school operations decision, or municipal services decision that is important, as opposed to shall we build a playground at this location or not, which is a detail, right? But before we make any of these major decisions, land use, schools, and municipal operations, we have to have some robust scenario-based, because nobody has a crystal ball, long range, which means 5, 10, 15 years out, planning to see whether or not we're going to go bankrupt, as the two issues on the table now, which is 228 acres for MBTA and Bloom, which is a senseless design.
I was just going to ask you to just talk, we're going to be running out of time soon. So, but I want to, because you somewhat addressed your concerns when we were talking about this development and the effect it had on schools. It's very similar to what you're talking about with Bloom. First of all, they're not planning for enough students.
I mean, Bloom is designed for 2,395 students. Right now, we have 30 more. That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I just don't understand who's thinking here. The reason is that the MSBA, to give us $100 million, has rigid, out-of-date procedures that have never imagined that somebody, in this case Lexington, simply cannot guess how many students we'll have in 5 years. It's impossible.
Right.
I cannot, the superintendent cannot, nobody can.
Right.
And the key here is to explain to the MSBA, really to the governor, because the MSBA reports to the governor, this is far above the pay grade of the bureaucrats at the MSBA, that it's impossible to accept that a new high school in Lexington would be sized for fewer students than we have now, when we may have literally 30% growth in the town's population in a few years.
Right.
So that, to me, is the only reason, the major, I mean, there are many other reasons which I could go over, why Bloom makes no sense. Now, why our school building committee is pursuing it is beyond me.
Right.
They claim they want to listen to the public. I had input to provide. I was never listened to. When a survey was sent to me asking, do you like design A, B, or C better? There was no place to say none of the above, let alone in the next box to explain why none of the above. That's not listening to the public. I like to say that I'm not smart enough to come up with the new ideas myself. I listen to the public. For example, years ago I asked, why is it that we let an employee take the healthcare benefits in Lexington if, say, her husband works for IBM? We're obviously subsidizing IBM by doing so. Do you think I got the idea myself? Not at all.
Right.
A teacher one day casually told me that her husband works for IBM, and of course they take the benefits in Lexington.
Right.
And so I started thinking, and I said, wow, this is major. So that's what it means to listen to the public. So if the school building committee did its job right, which in my view it has become as dangerous and as rogue an operation as our planning board, it would really listen to the public.
Right.
And it would say, wait a minute, we may have 4,000 new MBTA units in the next 5 years here. That's a 30% increase in the population of this town. Obviously, it will be a 30+% increase in the school enrollment that we have right now, which is 2,400.
Right.
Where are we going to accommodate that without squishing the kids like sardines?
Right.
And therefore, what's the point? We'll be back where we are now, which obviously we need a new high school. Obviously, the current facilities are inadequate, are too cramped. So they want to spend 2/3 of $1 billion to get us to the same place in 5 years. Makes no sense to me.
Well, with that, I want to thank you for coming. I'd like to offer you an opportunity to make any sort of last-minute comments, and tell people where they can find more, your website, how they can learn more about your candidacy, more about your background.
Well, I'm pleased to have created a website, which is patrick4lex.org. And over there, the public can see what my priorities are, which we discussed here with Jim. I also list under the March 3 election page all of my friendly competitors' web pages, as well as recordings of various fora, like this conversation today. And I really invite everybody to get informed, to please vote. I want to remember the public that in typical town elections, 85% of registered voters stay home, which means that 15% only vote.
That's disturbing, I know.
It is more than disturbing when some of my friendly competitors keep talking about, talking to the public. If they talk to 12.5 people, that to me doesn't mean that they know what the 85% really want.
Right.
So please get informed, and I very much would appreciate your vote for Select Board on March 3rd.
Patrick, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. This was good.